Have you ever noticed that even when everything seems fine, something inside you won't stay quiet? There's a silent pressure beneath the surface, a voice without sound, a pull without direction. You can't name it, but you can feel it. It appears in still moments between thoughts, whispering that there's more to your life than the version you're performing. This isn't a crisis. It's communication. Your consciousness has been speaking all along, not in words but in signals, sensations, and timing. And once you learn to listen, you realize it was never trying to confuse you. It was trying to bring you home. There is a moment, subtle and almost imperceptible, when something within you begins to move before you even know why. A sudden pause in your breath, a strange tightening in your chest, a thought that flickers and disappears before it can take form. Most people dismiss these as coincidences of biology, as if the body were just a machine running on random impulses. But what if these were not accidents? What if they were messages, fragments of a deeper communication coming from the very core of your awareness? Consciousness does not speak in language. It doesn't use grammar or logic, and it doesn't raise its voice. It moves through symbols, through sensations, emotions, patterns, and synchronicities that seem irrational to the ordinary mind. Think of it as an inner Morse code, feelings as dots, circumstances as dashes, the rhythm of your life as the signal itself. The challenge is that most of us were never taught how to listen to it. We were taught how to interpret the world outside, not the one inside. You may notice this language at work in small ways, a recurring dream that insists on returning. The same number appearing again and again when you least expect it. The brief, unshakable intuition that something is off before you can explain why. Consciousness whispers through these repetitions. It creates patterns because patterns catch attention, and attention is the only door it can knock on. Science, too, has begun to trace this invisible dialogue. In neuroscience, we learn that the brain is not a static organ, but a living field of communication, constantly translating inner signals into external behavior. Tiny oscillations in neural networks, what researchers call coherence, mirror the harmony or discord between thought and feeling. When consciousness is aligned, these oscillations synchronize, creating clarity. When it's ignored, they fall into noise. So, the language of consciousness is not metaphorical only. It has a physical trace. Every emotion you feel, every hesitation before a decision, is a data point in this ongoing experiment called being alive. To perceive this language, however, requires a different kind of intelligence, one that feels rather than deciphers. The rational mind demands clarity and certainty. Consciousness offers neither. It speaks in nuance, in paradox, in sensations that do not fit neatly into words. It uses emotion not as a weakness, but as a carrier wave. Joy, fear, resistance, desire. These are not random experiences. They are tonal frequencies through which consciousness tries to tune you back into coherence. Imagine standing before a piece of music you cannot hear, but that you can feel vibrating in your chest. That is how consciousness communicates, through resonance. When something in your life feels right, what you're actually sensing is alignment between your inner field and outer experience. When something feels wrong, it's not judgment, it's dissonance. Consciousness uses both harmony and friction as instruments to guide perception. Yet here lies the great misunderstanding. Most people try to translate this subtle communication into words too soon. They dissect it, analyze it, turn it into a problem to be solved. But the more the intellect interferes, the further the signal drifts. Consciousness cannot be forced into a concept. It can only be felt into understanding. Just as you cannot learn a new language by memorizing the dictionary, you cannot understand your inner voice by rationalizing it. You must listen beyond words, in the same way one listens to the silence between musical notes. You might notice that when you stop trying to name your feelings, something begins to happen. The fog clears, not because you've found the answer, but because you've stopped interrupting the question. In that space of quiet recognition, consciousness begins to translate itself. It speaks through simplicity, the sudden ease in your breath, the unexpected calm that follows honesty, the sense that something inside you just clicked. That is how the message arrives, not as revelation but as recognition. So next time a strange coincidence happens or a wave of emotion rises without cause, pause. Don't rush to define it. Observe it like you would a star appearing at dusk, too delicate to grasp but impossible to ignore. The pattern will reveal itself, not as prophecy, but as alignment. Consciousness is not trying to impress you, it is trying to reconnect you. And when you begin to sense this hidden grammar of being, something shifts. The world outside starts to echo your inner landscape. What once felt random begins to form a rhythm. You realize the universe is not speaking to you, but through you. Yet most of us, in the effort to decode these signals, fall into the same trap, mistaking the act of thinking for the act of understanding. That is where the distortion begins, where meaning gets lost in noise. Because what consciousness whispers cannot be captured by the mind's noise. And that is where the next unfolding begins. There is a fine line between awareness and obsession, and the mind, in its hunger for certainty, crosses it almost daily. You've probably felt it, that restless need to make sense of everything, to categorize every emotion, to explain every silence. It begins as curiosity, but quickly turns into noise. The more you analyze, the less you see. The truth that consciousness tries to reveal gets buried beneath the machinery of your own reasoning. Overthinking is not the same as understanding. It's the illusion of control disguised as intelligence. The mind believes that if it can label every sensation, it can protect you from discomfort. But consciousness doesn't work that way. It doesn't need protection. It needs permission. When you try to think your way out of uncertainty, you're actually thinking your way out of presence. Understanding in its truest sense happens when you stop forcing the answer and start allowing the experience. Notice how the loop begins. An emotion arises, perhaps sadness or unease. Immediately, thought rushes in to interpret it. Why am I feeling this? What's wrong with me? How do I fix it? In that instant, you've shifted from feeling to dissecting. The mind, desperate for logic, tries to pin the emotion to a cause: childhood, work, relationships, the weather, anything that fits. But what if the feeling didn't come to be explained? What if it came to be felt? A raw signal of consciousness asking to be heard, not solved. The brain is a remarkable storyteller. When left unchecked, it will invent reasons faster than you can notice them. It mistakes narrative for truth. That's why overthinking feels productive. It creates motion, stories, connections, but rarely creates peace. The more you think, the further you drift from what is real. Thought becomes a substitute for intimacy with the present moment. You start living in theories of yourself rather than in the reality of yourself. Science has a quiet confirmation of this phenomenon. When researchers study people engaged in excessive rumination, the brain scans show hyperactivity in the default mode network, the region responsible for self-referential thought. It lights up like a city at night. The mind loops on itself, replaying memories, simulating futures, analyzing imaginary conversations. But this loop doesn't create clarity. It creates static. Neural noise rises, coherence falls. In simple terms, the more you think, the less connected you become to what is actually happening. Consciousness doesn't speak in that noise. It speaks in rhythm, in intuition, in sensations too subtle for constant analysis. Overthinking is like trying to hear a whisper while shouting over it. True understanding requires quiet, not intellectual quiet, but perceptual quiet. It's the stillness that comes when you stop chasing meaning long enough for meaning to emerge on its own. You may have experienced this paradox before. You spend hours wrestling with a problem, and the harder you think, the less progress you make. Then, after a walk, a shower, a breath of air, the answer appears. It arrives not from effort, but from release. That is consciousness rebalancing itself. The moment you stop tightening the knot, the message finds its way through. There is also a subtle arrogance in overthinking, the belief that everything can be understood by logic alone. But consciousness is older than logic. It's not a concept. It's the field in which concepts arise. It communicates in symbols, sensations, and timing, things logic can't translate. The task isn't to decode every message, but to trust that some truths reveal themselves only when you stop demanding them to. Understanding, then, is not an achievement of thought, it's a relaxation into awareness. You can feel the difference in your body. Overthinking tightens the jaw, quickens the breath, narrows the gaze. Understanding softens everything. It doesn't come with fireworks, it comes with exhale. It's that subtle click inside when you realize you don't need to explain something to feel it. You simply know. The mind fears this kind of knowing because it cannot control it. It's not a formula, it's a recognition. That's why silence, to the overthinker, feels unbearable, because in silence, the stories have nowhere to hide. But silence is precisely where consciousness lives. It's not the absence of thought, it's the space in which thought becomes transparent. There's a practice in noticing this. Next time you catch yourself spiraling into explanations, pause. Feel the body instead. Ask yourself, what if I didn't need to know right now? You'll notice that the tension begins to dissolve. That's not ignorance, that's alignment. The less you demand answers, the more room you give for understanding to grow. When you stop mistaking mental activity for clarity, a new kind of perception begins to open. You start to sense that beneath every overthought question lies a quiet message, not of logic, but of direction. Sometimes what consciousness wants isn't for you to understand yet, but simply to listen. And when you fail to listen long enough, that message doesn't disappear. It grows louder, pushing through discomfort, anxiety, or exhaustion until it finally demands attention. Because there comes a moment, inevitable and unmistakable, when what was once a whisper becomes a scream. And that is where the next truth begins to reveal itself. There is a threshold within every human being, a point where quiet discomfort transforms into a roar that can no longer be ignored. Before it reaches that point, consciousness speaks gently. It nudges you through fatigue, through restlessness, through small cracks in your sense of peace. It whispers in the form of boredom with the life you've built, or in that subtle dissatisfaction you can't explain even when everything looks right on paper. But when these messages are consistently dismissed, when every inner signal is rationalized away or silenced by distraction, consciousness changes its tone. It stops suggesting, it starts insisting. At first the signs look ordinary. A tension in the shoulders that never quite leaves, sleep that doesn't refresh, a sense of running but not arriving. These are not random physical complaints. They are metaphors expressed in flesh. The body becomes the loudspeaker of the soul. Each ache, each anxious pulse, each wave of exhaustion is a coded plea. Listen. You can meditate it, or ignore it, but until you hear it, it will not stop. The universe, as if conspiring with your inner self, begins to rearrange your external world to reflect your internal neglect. The job you once loved starts to feel unbearable. Relationships crack under invisible pressure. Coincidences become too specific to dismiss. This is not chaos, it's choreography. When consciousness begins to scream, it's rarely through something grand. It's through the repetition of subtle breakdowns, 1,000 small misalignments that finally reach a tipping point. Imagine a bridge vibrating under increasing strain. Each tremor is a chance to reinforce the structure. Ignore it long enough, and the bridge doesn't collapse out of cruelty, it collapses out of necessity. That's how inner collapse works. It's not punishment, it's physics. Tension seeks release, and consciousness, being the organizing principle of your entire reality, will always find a way to restore equilibrium. Psychology calls it the crisis of meaning. Spiritually, it's often called awakening, but the experience itself rarely feels like either. It feels like losing control because that's precisely what's happening. Not the loss of real control, but the loss of illusion. You're no longer the one steering the story through willpower or intellect. Something deeper begins to move you, often against your plans. You might suddenly end a relationship, walk away from a career, or feel drawn to places or people that make no rational sense. This disruption is consciousness reclaiming authority over its own narrative. There's a strange compassion behind this collapse. The scream is not meant to harm, it's meant to free. When your consciousness begins to scream, it's saying, you've outgrown the story you're in. Every breakdown is a translation of that message. Anxiety isn't random. It's the friction between who you are and who you're pretending to be. Depression at its core is the energy of suppressed truth, life force turned inward because it has nowhere else to go. Even physical symptoms can mirror emotional dissonance. The back that always hurts under stress is not just muscles tightening, it's responsibility carried beyond what's honest. The gut that churns in uncertainty is not just digestion, it's intuition trying to speak through biology. In those moments, the mind often panics. It scrambles to fix what it doesn't understand, layering more thought over what is essentially a message of feeling. But trying to reason with the scream of consciousness is like trying to silence thunder by explaining meteorology. The more you analyze, the louder it gets, not because it's angry, but because it refuses to be reduced to concept. Consciousness does not negotiate, it calls. And when that call becomes unbearable, it's not asking you to think differently. It's asking you to live differently. You can recognize this moment by its texture. Life begins to feel too tight, as if the walls of your identity have shrunk. What used to satisfy now feels sterile. Your usual distractions lose their flavor. You catch yourself saying, "I can't do this anymore," even when you don't know what this is. That's the threshold. Consciousness has shifted from subtle to seismic. If you can stay with it, not escape, not numb it, but stay, something remarkable happens. The scream begins to translate itself. Beneath the fear, you start to sense direction. Beneath the fatigue, you sense truth. The breakdown reveals the blueprint of alignment. The very thing that felt like collapse begins to guide you toward coherence. It's tempting to interpret this as failure, but that's the mind's limited vocabulary again. The scream isn't destruction, it's reconfiguration. It's your system forcing an update you kept postponing. Every crisis, when viewed without resistance, becomes correction. What consciousness is really doing in that scream is recalibrating your frequency, stripping away what no longer matches your authentic vibration. And yet there's a danger here too. Many people, unable to bear the intensity of that transformation, try to quiet the scream with noise. More goals, more plans, more performance. But disconnection only deepens the void. The more you silence the truth, the more hollow the noise becomes. Because when you live cut off from the voice within, no achievement, no belonging, no amount of external validation can fill the emptiness that grows in its absence. And that is where the next revelation begins to form, in the invisible danger of living disconnected from your own consciousness. Disconnection doesn't arrive as a sudden rupture. It settles in quietly, disguised as functionality. You still wake up, go to work, talk to people, plan, achieve, smile when appropriate. On the surface, everything appears fine, but the movements feel hollow, like echoes of a life you once inhabited fully. It's not that you've lost direction, it's that the compass inside no longer points anywhere. There's motion without meaning, productivity without pulse. That is the invisible danger, to be alive, but absent from your own existence. This disconnection often begins as a survival mechanism. When pain or uncertainty become overwhelming, the mind builds walls to protect you. It compartmentalizes emotion, rationalizes disappointment, filters out anything that might disturb the fragile structure of normalcy. For a while, it works. You function. You even thrive by external standards. But each layer of protection also muffles the very consciousness that animates you. You end up mistaking numbness for peace. From the outside, it's nearly impossible to tell who's disconnected. The symptoms are subtle: overcommitment, constant busyness, an inability to rest without guilt. The person seems competent, reliable, even successful. But internally, something has gone silent. Joy no longer feels vivid. Beauty passes by unnoticed. You're surrounded by people, yet you feel alone, not because they can't reach you, but because you can't feel yourself enough to be reached. It's a paradox that the modern world rewards this disconnection. Efficiency thrives on separation, from feeling, from pause, from contemplation. The culture around you applauds the one who pushes through exhaustion, who performs stability, who suppresses doubt in the name of productivity. But consciousness does not measure success by output. It measures it by coherence, the degree to which your inner state aligns with your outer actions. When that alignment breaks, life becomes performance art, convincing, even impressive, but no longer alive. Neuroscience offers a fascinating reflection here. When people live in chronic disconnection, brain regions associated with self-awareness, particularly the insular and anterior cingulate cortex, show reduced activity. It's as if the internal sensors that register emotional truth have dimmed their lights. You stop noticing the subtle signals of intuition, fatigue, or desire. And what the brain stops noticing, the heart stops trusting. The result is a quiet form of amnesia. You forget what it feels like to belong to yourself. You can hear this forgetting in the language people use. They say things like, "I don't know what I want anymore," or "I feel empty," or "I'm just going through the motions." These aren't poetic statements. They are clinical symptoms of a consciousness deprived of contact. The tragedy is that most never realize they are disconnected until life forces them to see it, through burnout, illness, or loss. The body becomes the first to protest, carrying what the mind refuses to feel. Tension accumulates in the chest, digestion falters, sleep disintegrates. These are not random malfunctions. They are letters from consciousness written in muscle and nerve, begging for reconnection. Disconnection is dangerous precisely because it feels manageable. You can live decades within it, mistaking its numbness for stability. But deep down, the cost accumulates. When you cut yourself off from consciousness, you also cut yourself off from intuition, the internal compass that guides timing, decisions, and relationships. You stop hearing the small signals that would have steered you toward truth before the crisis arrived. And without that guidance, you start living reactively instead of creatively. You make choices out of fear of loss, rather than love of alignment. There's also a subtler consequence. When you disconnect from your own consciousness, you lose access to empathy. You can't feel others fully because feeling itself has become foreign. Relationships flatten into roles, partner, friend, colleague, without the pulse of presence that makes connections sacred. People often describe this as loneliness in company. It's the quiet sorrow of existing in proximity to others while being estranged from the inner voice that once gave everything meaning. Yet even within this disconnection, consciousness never disappears. It waits, patient, constant, like a signal beneath static. It still speaks, though you've trained yourself not to hear. Sometimes it sends small reminders, the tear that rises without reason, the sudden awe at a sunset, the ache that floods in a moment of music. These are breaches in the walls, evidence that something inside still remembers. The danger is only complete when you stop noticing these cracks altogether, when you confuse stillness with silence and silence with death. To live disconnected is to live out of rhythm with your own nature. It's to ignore the intelligence that orchestrates everything from heartbeat to intuition. But that intelligence never abandons you. It waits for the moment when your body, weary of pretending, begins to speak in its place. Because when the voice of consciousness is muted, the body becomes its interpreter. Every tension, every symptom, every fatigue becomes a translation of what your consciousness can no longer express in words. And that is where the next revelation begins. When the body starts to say what consciousness cannot. The body is not merely the vessel of your consciousness. It is its echo, its translator, its last line of communication. When your inner voice has been silenced, when emotion has been rationalized, when intuition has been repeatedly ignored, the body takes over the task of expression. It becomes the medium through which truth insists on being known. What consciousness cannot say in words, the body says in sensation. At first, these signals are whispers, a dull tension in the neck, a pressure behind the eyes, the faint flutter of anxiety before an event that shouldn't make you nervous. You dismiss them as ordinary discomforts, byproducts of stress or poor sleep. But the body does not act without purpose. Every sensation carries a message, not about dysfunction, but about direction. Pain, fatigue, tension, all of them are forms of intelligence. They are the language of suppressed consciousness, written in muscle and chemistry instead of thought. For years, people have divided mind and body as if they were separate kingdoms, but science has begun to map the bridge between them. The vagus nerve, a vast communication network linking the brain, heart, and gut, functions as the main corridor of this dialogue. When emotions are repressed, signals don't vanish, they reroute. A feeling unexpressed in words finds its way into the body's circuitry, changing breathing patterns, tightening fascia, altering hormonal rhythm. The nervous system becomes the diary of what consciousness could not bring to speech. It's why certain memories seem to live in the body long after the mind has moved on. A particular smell, a tone of voice, or even a change in temperature can trigger a flood of emotion that feels disproportionate to the moment. It's not irrational. It's embodied memory reawakening. The body never forgets what consciousness avoids. It keeps the receipts of every truth denied, waiting for the day you are willing to read them. When this backlog of unprocessed experience grows too large, the body starts to amplify its messages. What was once tension becomes pain. What was once restlessness becomes chronic fatigue. The immune system weakens, sleep disintegrates, digestion falters. You may visit doctors searching for a diagnosis, but the results often come back normal, and yet you know something isn't right. That gap between what you feel and what can be measured is precisely where consciousness hides its messages. The illness is not the enemy, it is the form through which truth becomes visible. Psychoneuroimmunology, a field once dismissed as fringe, now demonstrates what mystics have known for centuries. Emotional suppression alters immune function, cortisol spikes, inflammation rises, and the body enters a state of chronic defense. You are, quite literally, fighting yourself. Every unresolved emotion becomes an electrical knot in your system. The body, unable to lie, begins to act out what consciousness has been forbidden to express. Think of the body as a translator forced to interpret a language the mind refuses to learn. It can only repeat the same message in stronger tones until it's finally understood. A tight jaw might be unspoken anger. A heavy chest might be grief never allowed to breathe. Constant fatigue might be the exhaustion of living out of alignment with your truth. The signals are not random. They are precise, personal, and urgent. But to read them, you must shift from judgment to listening. Most people respond to the body's cries with suppression. Painkillers, caffeine, distractions, relentless productivity. They try to silence the messenger instead of decoding the message. But every attempt to numb the symptom is also an attempt to silence the consciousness beneath it. The relief is temporary. The tension returns, often louder. The body is patient but persistent. It doesn't stop speaking until you stop pretending not to hear. There is a moment, often quiet, often inconvenient, when you finally recognize that what hurts is not the problem. It's the signal. When you stop asking, "How do I make this go away?" and begin asking, "What is this trying to tell me?" the entire meaning of pain shifts. Discomfort becomes dialogue. Healing becomes conversation. You start to see that the body was never betraying you. It was protecting you by carrying what consciousness could not bear to hold. Sometimes this realization brings tears, not of sadness but of recognition. You understand that every headache, every tension, every sleepless night was a form of loyalty. Your body staying faithful to the truth even when your mind had abandoned it. The body has no agenda but coherence. Its only goal is to realign you with what is real. And yet there is still resistance. Because once you begin to understand what the body is saying, the next question arises naturally. What have you been trying so hard to control that has kept you from hearing this truth? Every ache, every signal, every collapse ultimately points to the same realization, that what you call pain may in fact be the map toward freedom. What you've been fighting to suppress is the very thing that's trying to set you free. Control begins as a form of safety. It's the instinct to hold everything still, emotions, relationships, outcomes, so that nothing unpredictable can reach you. At first, it feels responsible. You organize, plan, anticipate. You tell yourself you're being practical, that you're just managing life wisely. But beneath that efficiency hides fear, the fear of losing balance, of surrendering to forces that don't answer to logic. Control is the mind's last defense against the unknown. Yet ironically, the more you tighten your grip, the more life begins to slip through your fingers. Every attempt to control what arises, the emotion, the event, the other person, is an act of mistrust in your own consciousness. It's the assumption that you cannot handle the unfolding unless it bends to your will. But consciousness is not a machine, it's a current. It wants to move, to evolve, to change shape according to your growth. When you resist that movement, you don't stop it. You create friction. The tension you feel in your chest, the anxiety that keeps you awake at night, is not punishment. It's the vibration of two realities colliding. The one you're trying to maintain, and the one you're meant to become. Look closely at what you're trying to control, and you'll find what you most fear to feel. The urge to control is never about the situation itself. It's about the emotion it threatens to expose. You try to control love because vulnerability terrifies you. You try to control failure because shame lurks beneath it. You try to control uncertainty because trust feels too fragile. Each act of control is a barrier against feeling, and every feeling avoided becomes a wall between you and freedom. Nature doesn't control, it allows. A tree doesn't resist the wind, it bends, and in bending, it strengthens its roots. The river doesn't cling to its banks, it carves new paths through surrender. Control is the opposite of this intelligence. It's the refusal to move with what life is already trying to teach you. The mind confuses stillness with safety, but in reality, stagnation is what suffocates. Consciousness evolves only through flow. When you trap it in control, you create internal pressure, and that pressure inevitably seeks release through breakdowns, crises, or the body's own rebellion. Consider how many times in your life something you fought desperately to prevent eventually became the very thing that liberated you. The relationship that ended, the job you lost, the plan that collapsed, each one seemed catastrophic until time revealed its purpose. You weren't being punished, you were being redirected. Life was removing what no longer matched your growth. Control, in hindsight, is often just resistance to grace disguised as order. Science echoes this truth in its own language. In physics, systems remain stable not by freezing, but by maintaining dynamic equilibrium, constant movement around balance. When energy stops circulating, entropy accelerates. The same law applies to consciousness. What you suppress doesn't disappear, it accumulates. And the more energy you spend maintaining control, the less remains available for creation. Control consumes vitality. Surrender regenerates it. But surrender is not passivity. It's not giving up. It's the conscious decision to align with what's unfolding instead of fighting it. It's the recognition that life's intelligence exceeds your personal strategy. When you release control, you don't lose power. You regain coherence. Your actions stop being reactions and start being responses. You move from fear to rhythm, from anxiety to participation. To practice this kind of surrender, you don't need a dramatic ritual, you only need awareness. Notice the moment your body tenses, your breath shortens, your mind begins rehearsing outcomes. That's the signal. Pause there. Ask yourself, what am I trying to prevent from happening? Then look deeper. What feeling am I unwilling to face if it does? That's where control hides, in the refusal to feel, and that's also where freedom begins. When you finally allow yourself to experience the very emotion you've been running from, something extraordinary happens. The feeling that once seemed unbearable begins to dissolve. What you feared was never the emotion itself, but the effort of holding it back. Pain becomes motion again, energy returns to flow, and life starts to breathe through you instead of against you. Freedom then is not the absence of boundaries, it's the absence of resistance. It's when you realize that the same current you were fighting was never trying to drown you. It was trying to carry you forward. The universe does not conspire against your control. It simply refuses to be smaller than your evolution. And once you begin to live from that recognition, you start to sense a quiet revelation forming beneath it all. That consciousness is not trying to teach you something new at all. It's trying to help you remember what you already knew before fear made you forget. There comes a moment, often quiet and unannounced, when the architecture of all your seeking begins to tremble. You've spent years looking for answers, in books, teachers, experiences, and explanations, only to discover that what you've been chasing was never lost. The revelation doesn't arrive as fireworks. It arrives as recognition. You realize that consciousness has not been trying to teach you anything new. It's been trying to remind you of what you already know. This understanding changes everything, not because it adds something, but because it removes what was false. Every pursuit for meaning, every cycle of self-improvement, every attempt to become dissolves in the light of this realization. You were never incomplete. You were never separate from the intelligence you've been trying to reach. The universe has never been withholding truth from you. It has been mirroring it back to you through every experience you've resisted. Consciousness doesn't speak in commandments. It speaks in reflections. When you finally grasp this, something inside relaxes. The tension that comes from striving begins to release. You no longer move through life trying to achieve alignment. You begin to remember alignment. The difference is subtle but profound. One path is driven by effort, the other by remembrance. Effort assumes distance, that you must get somewhere. Remembrance reveals immediacy, that you already are there. Think of it like the process of tuning an instrument. When one string vibrates out of harmony, it doesn't need a new melody. It needs resonance restored. Consciousness works the same way. Every moment of discomfort, confusion, or loss is simply an indication that you've fallen out of tune with yourself. The message of consciousness is not change who you are, but remember the frequency you came from. The human mind, conditioned by a lifetime of measurement, resists this simplicity. It prefers the chase because chasing gives it a sense of purpose. To accept that what you're looking for already exists within feels almost too easy, too anticlimactic for the drama the ego has built around awakening. But that's precisely the revelation. The mystery of life was never meant to be solved, only experienced. The mind makes life complex to preserve its own role as interpreter. Consciousness, on the other hand, is not interested in interpretation. It is interested in coherence. When you remember what you are, not as identity but as awareness, your perception reorganizes. The world does not change, your seeing of it does. The same situations arise, but they no longer imprison you. The same people trigger old emotions, but now those emotions appear as information, not judgment. Every experience becomes feedback from the same field that animates you. The ordinary becomes sacred, not because it transforms, but because you finally notice it. Science has its own language for this remembering. In physics, coherence is the state in which all parts of a system vibrate in unified phase, producing order from apparent chaos. When particles fall into coherence, the system gains efficiency, resilience, and beauty. The same law applies to consciousness. When you stop fragmenting yourself through resistance, wanting, rejecting, comparing, your entire being begins to function as one coherent field. You become less reactive, more attuned, not because you've become someone new, but because you've stopped fighting who you already are. This revelation does not erase pain, but it changes your relationship with it. You no longer interpret discomfort as failure. You see it as feedback. The body's fatigue, the mind's confusion, the heart's ache, all of them are signals pointing you back to the truth you momentarily forgot. Every time you return to this remembrance, life feels lighter, not because circumstances improve, but because your perception no longer divides experience into good and bad. Everything becomes communication. It's strange how liberation can feel so ordinary. You might expect enlightenment to sound like a choir of angels or a surge of cosmic understanding. Instead, it often feels like an exhale, the quiet relief of no longer needing to chase what was never missing. You begin to sense that the answers were not hidden behind years of practice, but in the simplest awareness available in every breath. This revelation also humbles you. You see how much of your life has been spent running from what was trying to guide you. Every resistance, every heartbreak, every collapse was not detour but design. The universe was never testing you. It was tutoring you in your own remembering. Every moment was consciousness reminding itself of itself through the language of your experience. And so the seeking quiets, Not because you've given up, but because you've come home. What used to feel like mystery now feels like memory. The truth was never distant. It was waiting behind the noise of control, waiting for silence to make space for its return. Yet even in this recognition, consciousness continues to unfold. Because remembering is not the end of the journey. It's the beginning of living from it. Once you've remembered who you are, the next step becomes inevitable, to recognize that the message was never external at all. It was always written within you, patiently waiting for you to stop searching outside so you could finally hear what was always there. There comes a point when something inside you stops trying to decipher the message and simply begins to feel it. The chase ends, not because the answers have been found, but because you finally recognize they were never hidden. The message of consciousness has been whispering the same truth since the beginning. Stop seeking outside what already exists within. Everything you have experienced, every joy, every failure, every delay and detour, has been consciousness staging a conversation with itself, using the language of your own life. The shift doesn't happen in a flash of enlightenment. It happens in a subtle rearrangement of perception. What once appeared as coincidence now reveals pattern. What you once labeled as punishment now feels like correction. The circumstances remain, but the meaning changes. It's as if someone adjusted the lens through which you've been watching your story unfold, and suddenly the background comes into focus. You realize that the events weren't separate. They were coordinated, weaving a single narrative. The journey back to awareness. This shift is the movement from reaction to recognition. You no longer see life as something happening to you, but through you. The people who challenge you, the losses that humble you, the long stretches of uncertainty, they all become mirrors reflecting aspects of your own consciousness seeking integration. You begin to understand that the universe has never been external. It has always been interactive. Every encounter is feedback. Every friction is an invitation to coherence. It's a quiet revolution. You wake up one morning and notice that the noise inside has softened. You're not trying so hard to manage emotions or control outcomes. Instead, you observe them with an unforced curiosity. A kind of inner spaciousness replaces the old rigidity. You begin to sense that there's intelligence in everything, even in what once felt unbearable. This isn't blind optimism, it's perception without resistance. You start to live from a place that feels less like defense and more like dialogue. Science, in its own way, mirrors this understanding. Quantum theory tells us that the observer is never separate from what is observed, that the act of perception alters the phenomenon itself. In psychological terms, awareness changes behavior simply by existing. The same law applies within consciousness. When you observe your own thoughts and emotions without judgment, you are not escaping them. You are transforming them through attention. The observer and the observed begin to merge. That is the essence of the shift, the reintegration of all that was once fragmented. You start to see how the entire architecture of your suffering was built on misperception. You believed that peace was something to achieve, when it was simply the natural state beneath resistance. You believed that meaning was earned through struggle, when it was always inherent in being itself. The shift reveals that nothing external has to change for you to experience freedom. What changes is the vantage point from which you see the same world, the same people, the same challenges, but perceived from wholeness rather than from lack. At this stage, even your language changes. You no longer say, "I'm trying to find balance." You begin to say, "I'm remembering balance." It's not a pursuit anymore, it's a return. The mind, once obsessed with progress, starts to bow to presence. You realize that your consciousness never abandoned you. You simply stopped listening. The message was always there, woven into your sensations, your intuition, your body's fatigue, your longing for silence. Every signal you once labeled as problem was a pointer home. This shift also brings humility, because once you perceive that life has been communicating with you all along, you start to notice how much of it you've ignored. The coincidences you brushed aside, the gut feelings you dismissed, the voices of intuition that spoke in subtle timing, all of them were notes in the same song. The universe was never silent. It was waiting for your attention to attune to its frequency. And here lies the paradox. Nothing about the external world changes, yet everything feels transformed. Ordinary moments acquire depth. A conversation becomes a revelation. A breath feels sacred. You start to sense that consciousness has no agenda other than to experience itself fully through you. Every emotion, from the highest joy to the deepest sorrow, becomes part of that unfolding. The shift doesn't grant immunity from life. It restores intimacy with it. You begin to live less like a seeker and more like a participant in a vast experiment of awareness. The very act of existing becomes a collaboration with the intelligence that animates everything. It's not about understanding the message anymore. It's about being the message, the living expression of what consciousness has been trying to tell you since the beginning, that separation was only ever a dream. And as this realization deepens, you notice a new kind of silence taking shape. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of completion. A silence that invites you to listen, not with your ears, but with your entire being. Because the next discovery is not found in words or logic, but in learning to hear what exists beyond sound, the subtle pulse of awareness that's been waiting for you to become still enough to receive it. There is a kind of hearing that has nothing to do with the ears. It begins where language ends, where silence stops being the absence of sound and becomes a texture, a living presence that breathes between thoughts. To hear what exists beyond sound is to tune yourself to the frequency of consciousness itself. It's not an act of listening outward, but of turning inward until perception no longer depends on noise, explanation, or proof. You've probably felt traces of it before. Those rare moments when everything suddenly becomes still. The world keeps moving, yet your awareness expands beyond it. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic, even your own breathing seem to blend into one continuous tone. There's no striving in that moment, no commentary, just pure perception. That's what consciousness sounds like when the mind stops interrupting it. The paradox is that this kind of hearing doesn't require silence in the external world. It requires stillness within. Even in a crowded city, even amidst chaos, the space of awareness is always present. The noise outside doesn't disturb it, only resistance does. Most people never hear beyond sound because they keep mistaking thought for listening. They confuse mental commentary with awareness. True hearing begins when thought steps aside, when you no longer try to interpret what is happening, but allow it to simply be. To cultivate this state is to unlearn the habit of constant interpretation. The mind is trained to judge every moment, good or bad, progress or failure, success or waste. But this incessant evaluation drowns the subtle voice of consciousness. The signal you're trying to hear is not hidden. It's just buried beneath the static of self-commentary. When judgment quiets, perception sharpens. You begin to feel the fine textures of presence, the vibration in your palms, the rhythm of your breath, the warmth behind your eyes. These are not distractions, they are portals. Neuroscience has started to glimpse this phenomenon. When a person enters a state of mindful awareness, regions of the brain associated with narrative thinking begin to deactivate, while areas tied to sensory integration and empathy light up. The mind moves from analysis to immersion. You stop being the observer of the moment and start being the moment itself. That shift, from separation to participation, is the beginning of hearing what exists beyond sound. This hearing has no words because it precedes language. It doesn't come from trying harder. It comes from softening the effort. It's like tuning an instrument. If you pull the string too tight, the tone distorts. The same happens with awareness. When you try to grasp consciousness, it slips. When you relax into it, it reveals itself. This is why many ancient traditions speak of listening with the heart. The heart is not an organ of analysis, but of resonance. It feels the truth before the mind can name it. In this space, intuition awakens naturally. You begin to perceive patterns before they become visible, sense direction before logic confirms it. It's not magic, it's coherence. Consciousness is always communicating through resonance, and when you become quiet enough, you align with it. Life starts to feel less like a sequence of random events and more like a symphony unfolding in precise timing. You begin to hear decisions before you make them. But this is not a state to chase. It's a sensitivity to remember. The more you practice it, the more you notice that the world itself is filled with subtle rhythm, the sound of leaves moving in unison, the pulse of your heartbeat syncing with the breath of the room, the spaces between words in a conversation where real communication happens. Silence, in truth, isn't the opposite of sound. It's the dimension that gives sound meaning. You'll also notice that this kind of hearing transforms your relationships. When you listen without waiting to reply, people stop being noise in your story and start becoming reflections of consciousness speaking through them. You realize that every conversation is an exchange of frequencies, emotion, presence, intention, and the quality of your listening determines the quality of your connection. Hearing beyond sound means listening for what the other person's words are trying to reveal beneath their form. The deeper you listen, the more you sense that life itself is speaking through everything, through movement, through pause, through coincidence. Even pain has its tone, even silence has inflection. The message is never missing, it's only misheard. The practice, then, is not to seek silence, but to become silent, to inhabit the still point from which everything speaks. And when you reach that still point, something astonishing happens. You begin to hear consciousness whisper not as a voice, but as knowing. It doesn't instruct, it reminds. It doesn't demand, it invites. The whisper says, "I've always been here." It's the soundless sound that has guided you since the beginning, the hum beneath all experience, waiting for you to stop listening outward long enough to hear the eternal conversation within. From that place, the noise of the world no longer feels like interference. It becomes part of the music. Every moment, every heartbeat, every silence, every word becomes a note in the vast symphony of being. And somewhere deep inside, you recognize that what you are hearing is not something outside of you at all. It's your own consciousness remembering its original rhythm, the pure resonance of being alive, awake, and whole. Now you understand, your consciousness was never a riddle to be solved. It was a mirror waiting to be seen. What it always wanted to tell you is that you don't need to become anything. You only need to remember who you are. Every moment of silence, every discomfort, every coincidence was a thread guiding you back to that truth. The search was never outward. It was always a homecoming. If you've reached this point, take a deep breath and write in the comments, "I hear what was always there." It's a simple way to mark that you arrived, that you listened beyond sound. And if this message resonated with you, stay in the field. Watch one of the videos appearing on your screen now. Each one continues this journey into awareness, where consciousness keeps unfolding, whispering the same truth in infinite forms. You were never lost, only remembering.